I think they're the ones who are driving the agenda. And I think one of the things I'm trying to say in the book is that at its heart, there is this fundamentally irreconcilable debate about where does power come from? Does it come from God or does it come from the people? And that's ultimately what each side is arguing for. And obviously there are religious elements too, but I think fundamentally that's the thing at its heart. And it's quite hard to see how that will get settled without a civil war, I think, in the 17th century context.
This is CBS Eye on the World. I'm John Batchelor. It is October 1641. We're in Edinburgh, the centerpiece of a religious contest between Charles I, King of Great Britain, that includes England, Scotland, Ireland, Wales, King of Great Britain, and a man of self-elected worth called the New Covenanters. They're Scots, and their lairds and their lords, and they approached the religion of Christianity and the Bible profoundly differently than the Church of England. They want the bishops gone. They don't need bishops. They just need the word of God. We recognize them today as Presbyterians. In those days, there were many versions of Presbyterianism, including what we now call the wee kirk. I begin here because it is evidence of Charles I's attempt to both solve and trick his opponents in the 1630s and 40s. And those opponents would eventually become a revolution, a rising of Parliament, all of which would influence the relationship between kings and their assemblies across the continent. I draw upon a new book I highly recommend to understand the backstory of the American Revolution, The Blood in Winter, England on the Brink of Civil War, 1642. I welcome Professor Jonathan Healey of Oxford in particular, because he helped me in the first book that he published, The Blazing World, to understand that the 17th century is a transformative century from that was then the curse of the plague and the troubles of the 15th century and 16th to this is now a country that is moving towards parliaments leading voices that we see in the MPs today in London, the inheritors of the institutions that are now being established. Jonathan, a very good evening to you. Thank you. We go to Holyrood House, October 1642. There's a plot afoot, a plot driven by Charles I. He aims to either kidnap or murder two Scots lords who are leaders of the Covenanters, Argyle and Hamilton. Why does he want them out of the way? How will that solve things for him? And how does it go that night? Good evening to you.
Good evening, and thank you for having me on. I mean, it comes at a really pivotal moment in British history, in that Charles I had suffered a massive series of defeats in England. I don't mean military defeats, although he had suffered military defeats, but I predominantly mean political defeats. He had been forced by his parliament in England to have one of his leading ministers, the Earl of Strafford, executed. And a part of the reason that he'd had to do this was that he had suffered a military defeat against the Scots, who had rebelled against his religious policy. But in the course of rising against him, the Scots had adopted this sort of Presbyterian form of church government, and it created a really strong backlash in Scotland. And Charles had realised that this revolution had created a backlash, and he could then make something out of it. And if he could make something out of it, then what he could do is he could turn Scotland in his favour and then use it against England, because for him it was England that mattered most. And in Scotland, you've got this kind of growing split between these Presbyterian revolutionaries and a group who initially had supported these Presbyterians, but were gradually kind of moving away from them. And these were people associated with one particular figure, a man called the Marquis of Montrose, who's a very sort of dashing, cavalier, charismatic, quite dangerous figure. So anyway, Charles realized that he had the opportunity to kind of cultivate this sort of growing royalist group. And as he went up to Edinburgh, in the summer of 1641, he did sort of he had kind of two kind of things that he tried to do. One was that he tried to he tried to negotiate with his enemies, but at the same time he was plotting against them, and the plot would involve them some of their leaders being summoned to Holyrood Palace, which is the royal palace in Edinburgh, where they would be arrested and ideally put on trial in front of the Scottish Parliament for treason. And if they resisted arrest, then they would either be bundled onto a ship or possibly killed there on the spot. And it was an attempt by Charles to basically kind of decapitate, metaphorically but possibly literally, the opposition that he was facing in Edinburgh, and then allow Scotland to kind of flip to become royalist and then allow him to use it against England.
The plot goes very badly right away because it's betrayed. Again and again, Charles will be betrayed. It's an odd business that you include people in your conspiracy and then you don't have any confidence in them keeping the secret. The betrayal leads to Charles having to deceive everyone in Edinburgh who knows he was responsible. Did he do that thinking that they'll have to believe me because I'm king? He tells
Yeah,
some obvious falsehoods.
I think he probably did. I mean, I think he probably one thing that Charles regularly talked about was the word of a king. I am truthful about this, and I give you the word of a king, and I think he did have a very heightened sense of his own honor. On the other hand, when he did appear in Parliament and kind of, with tears in his eyes, he disavowed all knowledge of what he called this incident. And that's the name that this conspiracy ended up going by, the incident. He was, he was being pretty economical with the truth. He was pretending that he wasn't involved. But it's often the case with Charles that he always kind of maintained a layer of plausible deniability with these kind of things. The plot was arranged by people around him, and he wasn't obviously involved in it. But there's one moment that we fairly certain did happen, which was that a lowly, I think it was a captain in the army, went to see Charles in the middle of the night in Holyrood Palace. And there's no way that Charles was going to be having these kind of meetings with captains in the army unless he was very heavily involved with what was going on. And it seems indisputable as far as I can see, and most historians have agreed with me, I think, that he did know about the conspiracy. He was behind it, and it definitely served his interests. But of course, the failure of the conspiracy is a complete disaster for Charles because afterwards he's forced to basically concede all the ground that he was trying to recapture in Scotland. And one of the big things that is kind of dividing Scotland at this point is that the Scottish Parliament wants to get a series of political concessions from Charles, whereby they will have the right to appoint government officers in Scotland. Historically, government officers in England and Scotland have always been appointed by the Crown, but the Scottish Parliament was saying that actually, well, we want to be involved in that, and that's a very, very significant constitutional step. And after the incident, after this fails, Charles is in no position to resist that, and he just ends up saying, "Okay, you will have to, we will have to let you do that. Yes, you may appoint my privy councillors." So it's a catastrophic defeat for him in Scotland, and that's even before we get into the consequences that there were in England.
But they're waiting for him back in London. And one more detail. Charles is the son of James I. James I was also James VI of Scotland. Charles is no outsider to Scotland. He is effectively Charles of Scotland as well, and yet they reject him. They reject the idea that he has authority over them. Is that significant that they were going after the man who was their king, the son of the man who was their king once upon a time?
Well, I think in Scotland, I think James was much more palatable to the Scottish political elite, and one of the reasons was that James was very much Scottish. He'd grown up in Scotland. He knew how Scotland worked, and he had a kind of sense of letting Scotland run itself. Whereas Charles, although he had been born in Scotland, he'd left at a very young age. He left, as a toddler or as a very, very small child. and he didn't have that kind of feel for Scottish Parliament for Scottish politics. He was much more of a micromanager. He didn't want to let things alone. And the classic example of that is, of course, when he tried to impose an English style prayer book on Scotland, despite the fact that Scotland, in religious terms, had a very different culture to England. So, I mean, yes, he is. I mean, he was Scottish by birth, but he's not as kind of emotionally, culturally Scottish as James was, and that meant that he found it much harder to rule Scotland, and they found it much harder to respect him, I think.
The tumult of the last 400 years, we need to be very careful about who are the contestants. We have Charles I, who is a king by right. He is the younger son of James I, the man they believed was going to be the king. Henry died suddenly at the age of 18, breaking the heart of his father, James I. James died in 1625. Charles has been king since 1625 and has been up against Parliament for some occasions beforehand, including not calling Parliament for, I think, 11 years, a long time, because he didn't want to deal with them. However, he's now riding back to a Parliament that's very much in session, and we need to meet the expectations of Parliament. Jonathan, it's divided into two pieces, the Commons and the Lords, but very profoundly different attitude towards each other then that we know now. What power did the Lords have? What power did the commoners have between them? And what was their position of Charles? Was it united in any fashion?
Well, at this point, unlike today, the Commons and the Lords were sort of, roughly equal partners in many ways, and theoretically, the Lords was superior. But the Lords was much smaller in terms of numbers than the Commons. The Commons had about 500 members, the Lords, around about 100. And at this point, a lot of the real kind of political sort of momentum is coming from the Commons, and the as a general rule in this period, the Commons is more radical than the Lords. They're more oppositional when it comes to the crown. Sorry, the sort of forces of reform, the forces of opposition are stronger in the Commons. But in both houses, there is a balance. There are people who are broadly reformist, and there are people who are kind of becoming more obviously royalist. And actually, one of the things that had been happening over the last year, despite the fact that Charles had suffered this kind of incredibly humiliating defeat in England, is that his party in both houses was becoming stronger. And that really kind of underpinned a lot of the dynamic of the next few months, because you've got these kind of balanced forces in both houses, but with the Commons slightly more reformist, slightly more parliamentarian, if you like, the Lords slightly more royalist, and that very fine balance would become very crucial. And then the thing to remember, of course, is that any legislation has to go through the Commons, the Lords, and get the royal assent. So that means that there's this kind of real sort of tension about what the Parliament can do, because it depends, as it does today in representative institutions, it depends on the numbers. It depends on which party, if you like, to use an anachronistic term, can, get the votes.
This is called the Long Parliament. Why? Because it never actually recesses. It always keeps a committee floating no matter how many days they take off. The Long Parliament has an achievement that has alienated the king, the execution of Strafford. Strafford, a man by the name of Wentworth, was Charles's best idea for Ireland. What did he do to offend the Parliament, and why did he think it was necessary to execute him, Jonathan?
Well, he was dangerously effective, and that's bad news, because he's one of the few people who the reformists feel can actually galvanize Charles's side. But the other thing is about Strafford is that one of the tensions in English society in this period is a tension between what you might call, say, law and government, whereby there are certain things which are difficult to solve using existing law. And so there are people who argue that in those circumstances, the government can do what's necessary, even if it's not really within the law, and to reform the state, reform tax, create revenue, those kind of things. And Wentworth is a very, very I'll call him Strafford because that's what he is at the start of the book. Strafford is a really, really powerful advocate of this idea that ultimately, if something needs doing for the necessity of the state, then the crown can override the law to do that, and that is a very, very dangerous ideology for a lot of people on the other side because they think that that can lead to tyranny. So that's why they go after him. Um, Unfortunately, they because they're impeaching him. It's the sort of origins of the process of impeachment that you have in the US, and we've sort of lost over here in the UK. And when they impeach him, they impeach him for high treason. But the trouble is, you've literally got Charles I sort of sitting there in Westminster Hall during the trial, sort of nodding along and visibly showing his support to Strafford. So it's very, very hard to actually get the charges to stick.
And Strafford is amazed that Charles betrays him. And I think you write that Charles regretted this almost more than any other bad decision he'd ever made, letting Strafford go. Is that correct? And why
Yeah.
what did he get for backing down? What did Charles get?
Well, yeah, I mean it's an incredibly interesting question because the trial, the impeachment trial basically stalled. And the way impeachment worked is very similar to the US today, actually, where the articles are put forward by the Commons and then it's judged in the Lords. But the case that the Commons had was very, very weak, and the Lords recognized this, and Strafford and his legal team were able to basically kind of unpick them. So instead, the reformists went down a very different route, which also depended on parliamentary logic, but it was basically to pass a bill of attainder. And that is simply a parliamentary bill which declares that you are guilty of treason and can be executed. But that, of course, it's a piece of legislation. So that has to go through the House of Commons. It has to go through the House of Lords, and it has to get the royal assent. And the way that it happens is that
We
the
have 30 seconds, Jonathan. 30 seconds.
sorry, yeah, the crowd are used. So there's these kind of large crowds of Londoners outside the royal palace and outside the House of Parliament, threatening the peers and threatening the king. And so that's why he backed down in the end because he was afraid.
Professor Jonathan Healey. He's at Oxford University. He's also an author who's given us yet another story of the 17th century that is the backstory for the 18th century and the American Revolution. Remember now, there is a colony in the Americas. James I vouchsafed it even when the Spanish complained. And that colony is growing apace despite a very large death rate in the Chesapeake Bay area and along the North New England coast, the Pilgrims. That's going on and watching the events in Europe. They've left England. They get caught up in the war back in America. But what's going on right now in 1642 is by far the most persuasive for the case that is made by the parliamentarians that the people have a voice, that it's not entirely the voice of the king. There's a difference. There will become an argument. Does the king derive his power from parliament, or does parliament derive their power from the king? Jonathan, wonderful to do a tour of Westminster because the Common sits here, the Lords sit there, and the King's over here in Whitehall. So you provide maps. First of all, Westminster is not the same as the City of London. It's on the Thames. Where was Commons meeting in 1642? What was the room?
The Commons met in an old medieval chapel called St. Stephen's Chapel, which was quite a large chapel, but still very, very cramped for sort of 450 MPs. It's not as plush as the as where the House of Lords was sitting, and it's within this kind of very big palace complex called the Palace of Westminster, which is on the site of Parliament Day, but it's a much older set of buildings. These are sort of medieval buildings, very, very, complicated, lots of kind of corridors and lobbies and things like that.
And Charles, when he returns in to great celebration, the people are back, pleased the king has returned, sort of. This is a town estimated about 400,000 people. Very big city for Europe in 1642, one of the biggest and prosperous, but it's got its wars and its poverty as well. However, right now we're keen on where the king is going to take up residence with the queen, Harriet Maria. Where is Whitehall from Westminster?
So Westminster, Whitehall is between Westminster and the City of London. Of course, today Westminster and the City of London are all sort of part of the same kind of agglomeration. But at this point, they are two recognizably separate cities. London is, as you say, 400,000 people. It's very, very large. Westminster is it's got the Abbey, it's got the Houses of Parliament, and it's got some very sort of much more um, kind of high-end residences, often with aristocrats and people like that. And Whitehall Palace is right in the centre of Westminster, so it's close to Parliament, within sort of striking distance of Parliament, but it's also outside the City of London. Now, of course, Charles would rather be even further out. He'd rather be at Hampton Court, or one of his other palaces, like one of the other palaces are sort of all around the southeast of England. But he was specifically asked to go and spend Christmas in Whitehall. So, and he said yes. So he sort of puts himself right at the centre of this kind of twin city, if you like.
We need to introduce the players because, like a good play, there are characters who change their stripes in the middle of this drama. There is the junto. We have to start with that in the House of Lords and the junto in the House of Commons. What is the junto at the time? How does it express itself?
I mean, the word junto is used as a sort of insult, and it's often the case in English history that our political parties start out as, taking a kind of rude name and sort of taking it for themselves. And basically, um, it's like a kind of proto-political party, whereby there are people who are broadly reformist. They believe that Parliament should have greater power over the state and over the monarchy, and they kind of gather. They act together, they meet and they plot, and they coordinate their efforts in both houses. And the word junto comes from the word joint, because it's a joint party between both houses of Parliament, the Lords and the Commons. And so it's quite a good shorthand for the reformists, if you like. Now there are people who kind of come in and out, and party structure is nowhere near as organized as it is today in Western democracies, but it is becoming increasingly so. And they, as I say, they do coordinate, they do meet, and they do introduce legislation in a tactical manner. So that's the junto. They're the sort of reformist party, if you like.
Now, the junto have within them other factions that are pulling in different directions. The junto and the Commons and the junto and the Lords. The Puritans come to mind as the most important detail here. Not all Puritans are junto, not all junto are Puritans. What do the Puritans represent to Parliament, to Charles at this moment?
Well, I mean, Puritanism is a sort of long-standing tendency within the Church of England, but it had come under pressure in the earlier reign of Charles I, because Charles had basically adopted a kind of anti-Puritan stance in his church, and that would mean sort of much more elaborate church fittings, a lot more power to bishops, those kind of things which to some Puritans looked like they were kind of dangerously close to Catholicism, and that that sort of the backlash against that amongst many members of the political nation in England helped give the House of Commons and the House of Lords some of their momentum in 1640, 1641. So it was part of what they wanted to do was they wanted to reform the church and bring it back to a kind of more acceptable form of liturgy and form of church government. But at the same time, they were also very interested in protecting the country from arbitrary taxation. And these kind of two things tended to sort of intertwine a little bit. But yeah, I mean, Puritanism is a big part of what the junto want. But as you say, I mean, I couldn't summarize it any better. Not all Puritans are members of the junto. Not all members of the junto are Puritans. There's sort of, different shades.
To convey what a Puritan is in 1642, Christmas Day. How did they celebrate Christmas, Jonathan?
Well, the strictest Puritans would have treated it as any other day. They would certainly not have gone to church. They would have gone to work, and they would definitely not have spent the day in the alehouse. But as I say, there are different shades, and even under Oliver Cromwell in the 1650s, quite a lot of his sort of Puritan people in government still go home and celebrate Christmas in their own way, but they don't treat it as a sort of one of the biggest days in the year. So there's sort of skeptical of it without being completely against it. But then there are some hardliners who just think, we want to completely get away from
Right.
any kind of Christmas
In
celebration.
the 19th century, we would have called it Scrooge. In the 20th century,
Yeah.
we call it a Grinch for the children.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. That now there is a leader of the Commons junto, and we don't have time for all the men who are charged by the king with treason. But John Pym, what is significant about him? Because you identify him as a man with ideas to against the king. He is intellectual, but at the same time, he is a visionary. What does he see?
I mean, John Pym was a Puritan. He wanted to get the church back to where it had been sort of 20 years ago, but he's also someone who's very, very capable of standing up to the crown. And he's particularly interested in what he would call the liberties of the subject. And that's freedom from arbitrary taxation, freedom from arbitrary imprisonment. And he also believes that Parliament should have a much stronger role in the government. They should be involved in picking government ministers, and the king is sort of less important in his kind of view. In many ways, the really important thing about John Pym, though, is that he's just an incredibly skilled parliamentarian. He's a very canny operator. He knows when the good moments to introduce debate, introduce legislation. He's very, very forceful in debates. There's a few moments where he messes up and he gets laughed at, but they are far and far between. They are few and far between. And he's also someone who's very, very connected with the right people in the House of Lords as well. So he's got ideas, but he's also a really, really canny politician. So he's very dangerous to Charles.
A junto leader in Lords. Remember now, these are aristocrats, a lot of money, a lot of power. Is Mandeville. What do we need to know about Mandeville?
Mandeville's a really interesting character. He's very sort of effusive and popular. He's quite charming. He's quite well connected. His father was a key player in Charles's government, and he was particularly important, I think, in 1641 because he uses his house in Kensington as a place where the junto meet and they plot strategy. And because he's not a sort of first rank aristocrat, he's also, I think, quite well connected to sort of both ends. He's connected to the big aristocrats like the Earl of Essex, the Earl of Warwick, but he's also got those connections to members of the House of Commons. So he's sort of a linchpin, really, right at the centre of things.
England on the brink of civil war, 1642. There's a lot of violence for the fact that the Civil War comes after this book, but the violence turns on a debate in Parliament. Now remember, Parliament meets in St. Stephen's Hall. It's not lit by electricity. So when the day goes on, it's wintertime closing in. It gets dark, and they have to carry on their debates on by candlelight. It's quite charming. The Parliament never leaves. This is the long Parliament. but it turns on a vote. They'll divide the House the way they do now. And there's the Royalist faction, there's the Puritan faction, there's the junto. There are those wandering around in between, going back and forth. And then there are a lot of members who aren't there. Remember, this is 400 or 500 people, and you need to gather your forces for a vote. A lot of toing and froing and violence outside. This is now December of 1641, coming to the critical months of 1642. What is the remonstrance, Jonathan? Why do they argue about it so much?
Well, the remonstrance, or what 19th century historians call the Grand Remonstrance, but it's not a contemporary term, was an attempt by the junto to kind of galvanize their support by appealing to the people. And the context is that they've been losing ground in Parliament. The royalist group, the royalist party, if you like, were becoming stronger. And the remonstrance was an attempt to basically kind of show to the people what the junto were doing and what they were trying to achieve as a way of kind of gathering their support. The idea was that it would be passed and it would be printed. It's a very, very long document. It's full, it talks about what had gone wrong under Charles, what the Parliament had done to make things better, and what still needed to be done. And the idea was that it would be printed and sent to sent out to the people to get their kind of get their approval and again sort of galvanize support for the junto. And it was debated when it came to be debated. It was debated long into the night. And you talk about candles. One of the sort of procedural skirmishes that you get in this period is you get votes over whether to bring in candles, because if your side is losing the debate, you don't want to bring in candles because that will allow the debate to continue. So there's quite often these kind of procedural divisions over whether or not to bring in candles. Anyway, during the Grand Remonstrance, it was debated right into the small hours of the morning. It was debated until about 2 o'clock in the morning, and it was passed despite a really, really strong rearguard action by the Royalists. But the Royalists managed to rally and pass a resolution which basically said that it couldn't be printed. It would be passed, but it could not be printed. And then the other side came back and said, well, we're going to pass a resolution which said it can be published, but not printed. And so it was able to go out by handwritten. It's a huge document, handwritten for the bookstalls, but that was no good. The debates there are very, very fraught. They're quite well recorded, and they show that at this point in the House of Commons there is this really profound split between two different sides. And they're pretty equal at this point. The reformists have a slight advantage, but it's only a very slight advantage.
There's technology here. You've just heard it, but it will break it down. Printing. It's been known since the 15th century, but it's been dangerous to print documents that are dissenters, documents that are hostile. Suddenly it becomes obvious to people that there's a market here for daily information. The word diurnal, daily information, I learned from Jonathan for the first time, is the root of journalism, which is mispronouncing the word diurnal. So the people are about to be informed by pamphleteers or documents or printed sheets that are passed around about the occasion of days, the day's events. And the people outside want to be informed. I'm struck, Jonathan, by how widely there is reading at this time. And was that the credit to James and the Crown to make more people able to read now than ever before?
Maybe. I mean, the sort of longer story is that the century before the 1640s, there'd been this kind of growth in population, which had brought, wealth to quite a lot of people. If you were a labourer, then it was kind of bad news because your wages were going down. But if you had land and you were a prosperous shopkeeper, it was very, very good news because you could profit from higher prices. And a lot of that money which had been made during this kind of prosperous period had been spent on education. It had been spent on learning to read. So literacy rates are higher in the 1640s than they had been before, and they're particularly high in London. And the other thing in London is that people are all close together. So if you get a pamphlet, you go down to the ale house and you read it with your friends and you share it. You read it out if they can't read. So there's the development of a kind of early version of the public sphere going on here, and it gives that whole political dynamic a real edge because it is politics is popular politics. All politics is popular politics at this point.
Reminding everybody that AI makes mistakes, and so does the printer now and again. So you get a document that's smeared that has bad information on it, you have to adjust. I get the sense that there's a feverish conversation going on in all the corridors and all the streets of London, and the people outside are part of that dialogue. You said earlier with Stratford, they had a vote. So the people have a vote now when they're arguing remonstrance and afterwards. Is that correct, Jonathan?
Well, I mean, sort of, yes. If the people come out to protest, then that has an impact on what's going on in the in the House. So they don't formally have a vote, of course. There is one occasion in 1647 where crowds burst into the Commons chamber and do actively vote, but that's in the future at this point.
Yeah.
But yeah, the people are very much involved in politics.
The king also hears them, and the queen. We need to attend to him just a moment before we turn into the drama, the violence of December and January. Henrietta Maria, we have a minute here. She is easily the most attractive character because she's so mysterious. She's got a backbone. She's French, she's Catholic, and they want to persecute her because she's Catholic. So the Catholic persecution was part of the idea in Britain at this time. Is that correct? We have a minute, Jonathan.
Yeah, I mean, very tough time to be a Catholic, and as you say, Henrietta Maria is someone with a backbone, and it partly comes from this sense of isolation, but she's also a very clever political operator, I think, as well, because nobody knows the peerage better than her, and she ends up writing letters to peers to make sure that they turn up in the House of Lords for particular votes. So she's a very engaged and very sharp character. But also someone with very strong views and not someone who's attuned to the niceties of English politics, I don't think.
I love the scenes with her, Jonathan. She deserves a great deal of the spotlight. Poltroon, she says to the king. We think she says to the king. Poltroon, if he doesn't do what she wants. We're going to
Yes.
turn now to another plot launched by Charles. Another plot. Remember what happened in Edinburgh? Well, this time it's going to happen in London. Great Britain is a concept invented by James I, who was also James VI of Scotland, who follows Elizabeth and takes the crown of England in 1603. His first son, the man they believe will be the next King Henry, dies suddenly at the age of 18. His second son, Charles, becomes king when James dies in 1625. It is now 15 years later, and Charles has been king successfully, in his opinion and mine, for some time, ruling without parliament, nobody to say no to him. At the same time, Scotland has gone into dissent. Ireland is always dissenting. And though he is the king of Great Britain, Ireland, Scotland, England, and Wales, it can appear to be coming apart, not holding together. At the same time, Charles has to deal with an unruly parliament that has faction. I learned from Jonathan that we're about to plunge into Charles's solution for the factions in parliament and how he can regain the authority of his kingship to put together an army to march on Scotland, or because the revolt starts again in Ireland. They're always revolting every so many years. He can put together an army to march on Ireland. The only thing that unites, in fact, Charles's enemies in Parliament and Charles's loyalists in Parliament is they all want to march on Ireland. But, Jonathan, this is a wonderful telling because it's a conspiracy. And the conspiracy is well documented up to a point. It's the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd of January. What is it that Charles wants to achieve in consultation with his queen and a few others with Parliament? What does he intend to do romantically, disastrously? Thank you.
Well, at the start of January, Charles decided to launch impeachment proceedings against some of the leading members of the opposition. It's a sort of a very famous moment in English history. Most of us sort of know about it over here in the UK. Initially, it's all quite legal, and basically, what he wants to do is he wants to um, kind of slow things down in Parliament because he realizes that impeachment takes up a lot of parliamentary time. So it will stop them passing legislation that he thinks they're going to try and pass, which will take away his power of government and his power to raise an army. So he wants to kind of slow them down. And what he does is his attorney general. He has his attorney general introduce impeachment charges in the House of Lords against five MPs, five members of the House of Commons, and one peer, Lord Mandeville, who we talked about. And in his expectation is that the Lords will accept this and have these people arrested, and then he can rifle through their papers, find really incriminating evidence against other people, but also slow things down. But unfortunately, the House of Lords doesn't do what they're supposed to, and instead they basically kind of raise a procedural objection. They sort of say, well, impeachment should be started in the Commons. It shouldn't be launched in the House of Lords by the Attorney General. So we're going to create a committee, but it's going to be a committee which looks at the legality of what the king has just done. And this made Charles furious. The next night, that night, he went home to Whitehall. He obviously stayed up late with the Queen, and with the Queen kind of pushing him on, he decided that the next day he would take things into his own hands, and he would march on Parliament, and he would arrest the men himself. And that would be that would be the 4th of January, sorry, 1642.
The grab that he makes of their documents gives gives Parliament something to argue about, which is you can't take documents without a crime, without a charge. I agree with all of that, but the scene that is better than any other is the scene with Charles and Henrietta and a woman known as Lady Carlisle. And it's a cinematic moment, Jonathan. So I want to pause over it. Charles is unclear the road ahead, and he needs to explain to Henrietta Maria, his wife, why he's doing this and not that. He's grabbed the documents, but he hasn't grabbed the men. He's intimidated or in some fashion taking a step back because lords won't obey him. They want this argued in the Commons first, and they want to charge first before they try to impeach somebody. In other words, all process.
Mm.
How is it that that secret of what he's plotting gets out is the question you raise in your book. Guilty parties have been advanced for 400 years. Do you have a version that you're comfortable with?
Yes, I mean, I think it was Lady Carlisle who first leaked the information. She was a courtier. She'd been quite close to. She'd been very, very significant at court in the 1630s. But she'd been close to the Earl of Strafford actually. But after his execution, she'd gravitated towards the junto, partly because several of her family members were significantly involved with them. So she was very worried about the direction of travel. And if Charles was able to start arresting leading members of the junto, then it might be that members of her family would be next. But she's still at this point very close to the Queen, and she's this probably acting as a sort of double agent between the two. And late at night in Whitehall, Charles and Henrietta Maria seem to stay up arguing essentially about what to do next. And the Queen manages to use her sort of forceful persuasion to encourage Charles to decide on to go to Parliament himself the next day. And then at some point, Lady Carlisle got wind of this, so she was probably told. And then she disappeared off into the night, I assume, and then went and told probably Mandeville because she thought that he was a threat. He was under threat, and he then told the members of the House of Commons that they were under threat the next day. So when they went into the House on the 4th, they knew what to expect that day. They knew to be on alert.
For 400 years, we've had recorded in history after history that what Henrietta says to her husband, the king, is poltroon, go pull them out by their beards. Now, who heard that and who passed it on? Why do we have it 400 years later for the Queen to call Charles the poltroon in the middle of the night in Whitehall where he's plotting a coup? Who,
Yeah, well,
who tells us?
I mean, it sort of crops up. It crops up in a very, very obscure source several decades later, and the only way that I can really see that story getting out is if Lady Carlisle had reported that
Listened
specific
at the door of the
day.
closet, right? That's what.
Yeah, I guess. Yeah, I guess because there's thin walls in this period and raised voices, and I think people would have been able to hear these kind of things. There are historians who think, well, that's all sounds too good to be true, but it's sort of it's so specific. For me, it has the ring of truth about it. I'd like to believe it was true, um, but of course, one can never be completely sure about these kind of things. Looking at the 350 years.
Everyone's available. If you meet it for the first time in Jonathan's book, you're all available for your own version of how it happened. And
Yes.
400 years later, the the plot was betrayed by someone who heard the Queen yell "Poltroon." Now, there's nothing wrong with Henrietta Maria. She sees exactly what's going on. She understands that Charles must act with dispatch. And in this instance, he doesn't back down as he likes to do, come up with a great plot and then doubt himself. He shows up in Parliament, and he's there to make arrests. This gets another scene. Remember, we're in Westminster now. Another scene. King standing there, surrounded by his guards who've come in to make the arrests. Where are the five? What's happened to them?
Well, they've escaped. They had been warned, and they'd come into Parliament that morning. They got the warning probably from Lucy Hay. They'd also had a warning from the Earl of Essex. At lunchtime in Parliament, they'd sent someone up to the Palace of Whitehall where they'd seen a sort of large collection of armed cavaliers, armed soldiers who'd been there for a while now, and they'd sort of seen that they were getting ready to do something. And then when Charles came out of Whitehall, gathered together these cavaliers and started, going down the street towards Parliament, a lookout posted by the French ambassador saw them and then ran all the way down the street to Parliament. So they'd heard that he was coming, and as he was coming into Parliament, they were escaping through the back door down the stairs right down to the river because, of course, Parliament is on the river as it is today. And they slipped onto a boat and then sail. Well, they rowed along the Thames into the city of London. So they made their escape, and so Charles is stood there in the House of Commons, saying, where are my where are my five members? And they said, well, they're not here. They've gone.
I read a lot of history in university, and I've read a lot since. Jonathan's book introduces you to a world that we come from. The 17th century, you remember your date, 1607. That's Jamestown. 1619, that's the Pilgrims. All of this material is watching England, Great Britain, in civil war or building towards civil war in the 17th century when power would pass from the king to the parliament. Constitutional monarchy, we call it today. That would be the model for the founders in the 18th century, which is why all this backstory is so helpful to understand our institutions. We come now to not an institution, but the question of health of the republic or health of the empire or health of the kingdom, the plague. It returns in the 17th century, never more worrisome than in 1660s, but it strikes that winter in only London, Jonathan, or was it throughout the land?
Well, at this point, the plague tended to hit city by city. When the Black Death first arrived in England in the 14th century, it just, swept through the country very, very quickly. But now, ever since that, it sort of pops up in one place and then disappears and then goes somewhere else. So it was in other places a little bit, but the main centre at this point was London and Westminster. And that summer, in particularly, the summer of 1641 had been very, very bad. Plague had got a lot had been killing quite a lot of people. By the winter time, because of the particular kind of seasonality of plague, it was starting to die out. But yeah, it had been a sickly year.
The reason the plague is important here is because members of the House of Lords and those who could afford it in Commons have fled the city and are called to return to Parliament. Remember, this is the long Parliament. It never really recesses. It has a committee that's always meeting permanently. It's a process fiction. But Charles has reason to believe that his numbers will strengthen to dominance on January 12th.
Mhm.
He's not the only person who knows that. The junto at this time, Jonathan, what does John Pym make of Charles's attempt? Does he think that it was nearly successful and we escaped it? Or does he use it against the king? How does he explain to the parliament and even to lords what the king's afoot with?
Well, the proclamation whereby Charles tried to get his supporters to come back to Parliament is the sort of background, if you like, to the attempted impeachments of the early January. Because one of the things that Charles is hoping is that he can sort of slow things down until January the 12th, as you say, when he'd get these sort of moderate MPs back. But the attempt on the five members kind of just dramatically changes the landscape. And whereas Charles was in a position before that he might have been able to sort of gather a very, very strong, well, actually a majority in both houses. He's now completely lost that because people are looking at the royalists in fear. And those moderates in the middle have really kind of swung behind Pym and the junto. So it's a catastrophic decision by Charles because it makes it look like he is a military threat to Parliament. And that means that a lot of moderates kind of dramatically swing against him.
What's going on outside is important here because the crowds make a lot of noise, but many of them are parts of gangs that are gathering in the night and very dangerous. But there are two groups that we need to pay attention to. The Cavaliers, who are royalist associated, the Roundheads, who are Puritan associated, the mob that's in between, and one group I found fascinating, the apprentices. What do they represent in London at this time, Jonathan?
That's a really interesting question, and actually, the word roundhead, although it's often said to come from the Puritans who wore their hair short, the other people who had to wear their hair short were apprentices because their masters insisted that they looked smart. So roundhead was also an insult aimed at the apprentices, and they're basically young people who are learning a trade, and they're often quite a volatile group. If there's any kind of street protest in London, much as students would be today at the forefront of it, apprentices would be in the 17th century. So they are a very kind of vocal group. They make up a very, very large proportion of the population, and they are, as I say, they're young. They're also impacted by poor trading. There's bad trading at this point, and they are. I mean, I think that they're also particularly in tune to they're particularly attuned to ideas about tyranny because they are looking at their work situation where they have this master, and if that master acts tyrannically to them, they can sue them in the law courts. So they kind of have this idea that they have rights, and I think that helps them think about the monarchy in a particular way. But yeah, I mean, London's very, very volatile at this point, and you've got lots of demobbed soldiers coming back as well from the army, which had been raised to fight Scotland, had not done so. It had then been disbanded, and a lot of the soldiers then came back to London and became the Cavaliers, as you say. So it's a very, very volatile situation on London streets.
And when it gets dark, it's very dangerous to be out on the street. Very dangerous. And things happen outside of Whitehall, things happen outside of Westminster that they're not sure of. It's spooky. Plus the plague's out there. So lots of violence. There are lots of threats. There are people grabbing their weapons. They're threatening in the crowds. They swing sabers at each other. But the threat that upsets the king more than any other, in my imagination, is the threat to impeach the queen, Henrietta Maria. And that may drive decisions by the king. It also is going to lead to it's time to flee. But before with the fleeing, I want to come to what happens in late January. There's violence every night, Professor. And the violence can seem ceremonial, as if there are crowds coming out and crowds not coming out. There are several nights where the crowds don't come out. Is it organized in any fashion, or are people really spontaneous?
And historians have debated this point for many, many years, and I think there must be some kind of organization. The there's definitely a few there's one particularly striking moment where there's a report and it shows that there's a debate going on in Parliament and the junto are losing. So someone runs into the city of London, goes to a shop where they know someone will be, finds one of the MP's wife, and she gets calls out the crowd, and then the crowd of people go down to Westminster. So there's obviously some organization, and I think also the pastors, the ministers, the ministers of the gathered congregations are also bringing out the crowd, and also when the crowd are no longer necessary, they tell the crowd to go home. So there's definitely some organization, but I do think there's also a capacity for spontaneous crowd action as well. So it's a bit of both, really, I think.
Old Testament, First Kings 1, 2 to 1, 5 to 6, 15 to 16. A passage. To your tents, O Israel. You make that a chapter late in the drama. Why? What happens?
Well, for me, this is the moment that Charles really kind of realizes that he's losing control. And the day after he tried to arrest the five members in Parliament, he tried to do it again, this time in the City of London. And he went to the City of London. There was a big crowd, and he was rebuffed by the city government. So he went for lunch with the sheriff, one of the sheriffs. And then after that, he got in a coach to go home back to Whitehall. On his way, the coach was surrounded by crowds, and someone ran up to his coach and threw in a pamphlet entitled, well, I mean, it had a longer title. It basically sort of reported what had happened the day before, but it had this biblical passage that you talk about, to your tents, O Israel. And it's basically a call for the nation of the biblical nation of Israel to withdraw its support from the house of David because the house of David had become tyrannical. And it, the you know the sort of innuendo is very, very clear that Charles is acting as a tyrant, but also the fact that people can get that close to his person, and that coach, which is supposed to be this sort of barrier between him and his people, is permeable, means that I think he suddenly gets very, very frightened, and within a few days he left he left London.
Is that when they changed the locks in Whitehall, or had they done that earlier? I don't remember the.
No, so the lost key in Whitehall is one of those things that I discovered in the archives. I don't think anyone's ever found that before, and I would love to think it was significant. But basically, one of the king's nephews, who's actually considered as a potential pretender, loses his keys on the day of the 3rd of January. And there's a record in the sort of the household account saying that a new set of keys for this guy. So I'd love to I'd love to have been a fly on the wall when it was discovered that those keys had gone missing in the midst of all this kind of anarchy on the streets of London.
I know I'm reading backwards, Professor, but it's impossible to ignore the fact that this is a man who will suffer regicide as he makes decisions here. And you might say that he's protected by large, organized, and very capable soldiers at Whitehall. But I felt that he was vulnerable every moment, especially where passages where you would say he would disappear into the warrens of Whitehall. Anything could have happened in those corridors.
I think that's right, and I think he feels vulnerable. And the other thing to bear in mind about Charles and Henrietta Maria is that they had both suffered assassinations to people that they were close to. Henrietta's father, Henry IV of France, had been assassinated. She was a baby at the time, but she knew about it. And Charles, of course, had lost the Duke of Buckingham, who'd been assassinated in 1628. And so they are both very conscious that the people are not just a kind of they're not just a concept. They are potentially dangerous, and their lives are at threat if they go the wrong way. So I think that's true. I think we have to understand this kind of background of threats that they are experiencing if we want to understand their actions. I don't think it's irrational of Charles to be afraid, I think.
Charles and Henrietta Maria make a decision to flee. They descend into a boat and are off to Hampton Courts. What does Parliament make of the king leaving the city? Is it satisfied? Is it frustrated?
Well, I think, I mean, they spend a lot of time trying to get him to come back, and I think the realization in Parliament with the king gone, is that it becomes much harder to sort of come to a settlement, if you like, and I think the realization at that point is that if we don't do something pretty serious in terms of negotiation, then we are going to end up in a civil war fairly soon. So although it's a sort of victory for the junto, I think it's a very uneasy victory because of what it represents. I think what they'd hoped for is that Charles would back down and give them the political reforms that they want. Instead, what he'd done is he'd run away because they'd frightened him, and I think that meant that the realization was it wasn't likely to end in compromise and a kind of set of articles of agreement. It was going to end in a battle. So yeah, it was unnerving, I think.
There's a scene that is very convincing when they flee to Hampton Court. It was not prepared for them, so the rooms are
Mm,
cold and the fires are not lit, and they sleep together as a family that night. And I saw them extremely representing the old world that's about to
mm,
pass away. And
mm.
we come to what it is that Parliament does over the next weeks. But before that, Henrietta and Charles have a meeting, and they've got new plans now. Where is Henrietta going?
So Henrietta will go to the continent and she will try to raise forces, money, and potentially armed forces to come over and support Charles. Um, Whereas he will go and set up a court somewhere, and he ends up setting up his own court in York, which is quite a long way from London, and that means that the potential for a negotiated settlement gets even further away. Um, and I think, the fact that Henrietta has been sent over to the continent to raise forces, I think Charles has realized that he's not going to put down Parliament without using force. So he's kind of come to an acceptance that he will have to raise an army against these people. So yeah, I mean, again, it's another step towards the sort of inevitable end, which is pitched battles.
As Charles makes his way north, Parliament is passing laws that again and again reproach the king or rebuke the king or reject the king as an authority. They take away from him the power of raising soldiers, I think.
Mhm.
They already had the power of purse. Surely they knew that that was pushing him towards violence. Is that what they expected? They wanted him to make the first move?
There's some would say yes. I think the one of the things that is very, very central to the way that parliamentarians are thinking at this point is that they are still afraid, and they are afraid of the rebellion in Ireland, and they are afraid of the Cavaliers, and that what Charles had done on the 4th of January had made them afraid of the people around him. So as a result of that, they tried to take control of the militia. And but of course, as you say, Charles was not willing to allow them to do that. So they had to do something which was actually quietly very, very radical, which was that they passed an ordinance rather than a bill. And an ordinance is basically something which has gone through two houses of parliament but not been given the assent of the king. But it has the force of law, and it has the force of law because the king is indisposed. Now, if the king had been away and not contactable, that was fine, but he was there and he was literally saying, I don't agree to this. And so the fact that they're passing this ordinance and then putting it into and treating it as law is a very, very radical statement, and it's very, very hard to see how you go back from that, because they are claiming kind of sovereign authority over the kingdom. So that's why that militia ordinance is such a critical moment. And you're right, no, Charles would never assent to that. And in fact, at the same time, he starts to raise his own forces by using something called the commissions of array. And then gradually you're getting these kind of two armed camps, which is the next stage that you want, that you need for a civil war. You've got two armies growing.
There are scenes here that are hard to believe. You all remember the scene in Monty Python and the Holy Grail where they arrive at a French court and demand to be let in because they're on a mission from God or something like that. And the lord of the castle shouts down at them and throws things on them and says, "You can't come in." Well, that actually played out as Charles marched north. He wanted a port city with weapons. That would be Hull. Is that correct, Jonathan? Do I remember that
Mm.
right?
That's right. Yeah, yeah.
And they shouted. Did they really, as you position it, was the report back to Parliament that they were shouting at each other and Hull wouldn't open its gates?
Yeah, I mean, the governor is standing on the gates shouting down to the king, and the king is shouting back or having his people shout back. And it's quite farcical in many ways. It's also of immense constitutional significance because what Parliament are doing, or what the governor of Hull is doing, is he's saying that the king shouldn't be allowed access to this stuff because Parliament says that he shouldn't. So then there becomes a question as to at what point, does the king have a right to go into all of his castles and all the sort of square yards of England's land? So it's a very, very significant moment. It's also very humiliating for Charles, because he is being rebuffed in this way, and it's of huge military significance because, as you say, Hull is full of weapons, and it's a really key port on the River Humber, which would be a landing point for any sort of foreign army. So it's a very, very significant moment. And it's after what happens at Hull that Charles starts explicitly talking about the fact that Parliament is waging war upon him. So he's talking a bit as if war has been declared, really.
This is 1642, the summer of 1642. Charles has been moving north towards York. He eventually achieves it. But I want to step back just a moment and understand the spirit of history for 400 years. I I get the sense from your book, Jonathan, that it's never really been resolved whether Parliament was right or not in the way it conducted its affairs. That there have been epochs ever since coming and going in my country and your country where there's doubt about the decision to challenge authority. Is that still true in 21st century Britain, doubting about challenging the king?
I think that is true. Yes, I think if in the later 17th century, I think people believed that the parliamentarians were wrong. I think into the 19th century, when you've got the sort of Whig tradition of history, uh, a lot of historians essentially believe the parliamentarians had right on their side. I think the 20th century has made things um, a little bit more balanced, if you like. I mean, I think from the point of view of modern liberal democracies, I think it's hard to argue a royalist position, but I don't think as historians we necessarily should be doing that. We should be trying to put ourselves in the 17th century, and then it becomes a lot more complicated. And one of the things I've really enjoyed actually about writing this book is to try and understand where the royalists were coming from. What did they believe? Why did they make this particular choice? They turned their back on the idea of a representative constitutional monarchy. And what was it that made them do that? And I think it's things like loyalty, it's a belief in the old church, it's a worry about the uncertainties and the potential for chaos that there would be in a revolution. And I think it was really interesting to think about the events from their point of view.
I agree with you. I'm trying to go to the one man who you spend a deal of time with following his life, John Banks, who I believe
Yeah.
starts on one side and drifts to the middle and then drifts to the other side. Is that correct?
Yes, and he's a. I basically wanted a figure who could sort of represent the kind of, I don't know, the soul of England, if you like, in a way, and being forced to make these decisions. And he was a really interesting one because his family are quite legendary in this country as being they're legendary royalists. Their castle is sort of still kind of very the signs around it are all about how royalist they were, but actually his story was much more balanced. And there's this kind of so he's a very successful lawyer from quite a humble background. He was central to royal government in the 1630s, but as you say, he sort of drifted towards the centre in 1641, and in 1642 he was named as one of the militia commanders by Parliament. So he'd sort of gone over to or people thought he'd gone over to the parliamentarian side. side. And then in 1642, he wrote these really kind of moving letters, I think, to all these kind of parliamentarian figures, trying to get them to come together and sort things out, and trying to sort of bring things together and create consensus and avoid civil war. But he was obviously unsuccessful. And I thought that part of the story, that belief, that kind of vain belief really, that these things could be sorted, and actually people wouldn't have to end up taking a decision on one side or the other, was, I thought, really, really interesting and really humane. And of course, in the end, he did have to take a decision. He became a royalist. He died during the Civil War. He didn't die in fighting, and his castle was blown up. So it sort of, his family was ruined. So it was a real kind of tragic ending, I think, to the
He married
story.
well. I want to speak of Mary because
Yeah, I mean, yeah, he married well. Mary was an incredible figure, another one of these incredible figures from the 17th century. Had a lot of children, and then she is now more famous than him because she's the one who holds on to Corfe Castle against the parliamentarians, and she's sort of known as Brave Dame Mary, because she's one of these very, very kind of forceful characters who holds on to castles in the face of real adversity. So yeah, I mean, she's a fascinating character as well.
and the war that they made on her was unjust. The parliamentarians become extremely violent. I understand the king's forces were violent too. There was nothing but cruelty on all sides. The
Hmm.
puzzle is why there wasn't a committee coming forward for compromise. Was that ever debated? And I know we have the next book to get to. I'm anxious for it. Uh, there were a number of figures here who could have come forward and say, let's talk about this. Did they, Jonathan?
Yeah, I mean, people did, and that's what Sir John tries to do. He tries to sort of bring people together. But I think in 1642, the differences are just irreconcilable at this point, and the forces on both sides. And it's not just the kind of radicals on the parliamentarian sides. There's the sort of hardline Cavaliers as well, who are pushing for a military solution. I think they're the ones who are driving the agenda. And I think one of the things I'm trying to say in the book is that at its heart, there is this fundamentally irreconcilable debate about where does power come from? Does it come from God or does it come from the people? And that's ultimately what each side is arguing for. And obviously there are religious elements too, but I think fundamentally that's the thing at its heart. And it's quite hard to see how that will get settled without a civil war, I think, in the 17th century context.
Is Henrietta Maria remembered today, Jonathan?
Not really, and actually, she has quite a bad reputation, unfairly maybe. She's sort of seen as being a kind of real hardliner who's sort of pushing the king towards much more militancy, I suppose. And there's definitely elements of that, but I think she's someone who is very, very interesting in the context of her time. I think it has a very understandable set of ideas. And she's a Catholic in a very, very anti-Catholic
Uh,
country, and that
executing
conditions her.
executing monks routinely.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah, yeah. And executing Jesuits and
uh,
preachers, and yeah, I can understand why she was how she was.
Blood and Winter, Jonathan Healey, waiting for the Civil War book coming soon. This is Yes, Eye on the World. Thank you, Jonathan.
Thank
I'm
you
John,
very much indeed.
I'm John Batchelor.